Ever wanted to learn about every cancelled X-Men game? Find out in every cancelled X-Men game. Game Facts Special. There are more than 5 cancelled X-Men games, from the Sega Genesis all the way up through the PlayStation 3. We'll be looking at all of them in this episode. In 2009, an X-Men game was greenlit with developer Silicon Knights at the helm. The Canadian studio was highly regarded at the time for its work on Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain, Eternal Darkness, and Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. X-Men is a beloved IP, and an action RPG made by a studio of this pedigree left many in a state of unbridled hype. Then the game came out. By all accounts, XMen Destiny was a mess. It received aggregate scores ranging from 32% to 50%, depending on the port. But it was universally panned for mindless gameplay and an upsetting lack of polish, which dashed any hopes of a sequel. Unfortunately, the very deal that has led to the Marvel Universe as we know it now likely ruined this game. When XMen Destiny went into development, the Disney/Marvel deal had just gone through. One of the results of this deal was that the budget for the X-Men game was slashed, which only worsened a reported indifference towards the project by the management involved with the game. Silicon Knights president Dennis Dyack released a video statement outlining the situation surrounding the game, and even revealed that the studio put $2 million of its own money into the project to help it along, but it just wasn't enough. That tragedy was followed by the delisting of XMen Destiny and other Marvel licensed games developed by Activision in 2014 due to parameters of Marvel's Disney acquisition. Finishing the devastating combo was the issue between Silicon Knights and Epic Games due to the developers' misuse of the Unreal Engine. Because of that, XMen Destiny was recalled and all remaining unsold copies were destroyed. This sequence of events essentially erased XMen Destiny from the face of the earth. When you are finished with this episode, we've got cancelled game episodes on Batman, Spider-Man. Check out those videos after you finish hearing about X-Women, the Sinister virus. This next game is pretty interesting. In the 90s, X-Men games were big business for Sega. 1993's X-Men and 1995's X-Men 2, Clone Wars sold very well on the Sega Genesis, and even led to a trilogy of X-Men games, released yearly from 1994 to 1996 on the Sega Game Gear. Despite these previous successes, a planned sequel to Clone Wars never made it to market. After the release of X-Men 2, Clone Wars, another game entered development at Clockwork Tortoise, a studio that was being praised at the time for doing great work on the adventures of Batman and Robin for the Sega Genesis. The interesting twist on this third game was that it would focus solely on the female X-Men, and was appropriately titled X-Women, the Sinister virus. In the game, a virus developed by Mr. Sinister had infected all of the male X-Men, and it was up to the girls to stop the villain and find a cure. The game presumably entered development sometime in 1995 because it was present at E3 1996 in an early but playable state, and Sega had it pinned down for a late 1996 release at the time. However, internal issues at Clockwork Tortoise caused development on the game to be tumultuous, and led to several delays until it was finally cancelled. The only existing evidence of the game is promotional images and video, although the game was allegedly shown at Epcot's Innovations exhibit in 1997, X-Men Mutant Wars PlayStation. The year 2000 saw the release of Bryan Singer's first X-Men film, in addition to launching a massively popular film franchise and Hugh Jackman's US acting career. It also spawned a new age of X-Men video games. To coincide with the film's DVD and VHS release in November 2000, X-Men Mutant Wars launched on the Game Boy Color. Developed by HAL Laboratories, the makers of the Kirby games, Mutant Wars was a side-scrolling beat-em-up that featured Wolverine, Gambit, Iceman, Storm, and Cyclops as playable characters. Players could freely switch between these characters at will during gameplay, which was necessary because the power level of the mutant in use would decrease over time. Switching characters gave the previous character time to regenerate and gain their strength back. For its time, Mutant Wars had some novel concepts and a great soundtrack by Kazuo Osawa, the composer of River City Ransom. However, the game was poorly received, with an aggregate score of just under 50%. A planned port of the game was ultimately scrapped. Prior to the game's release on the Game Boy Color, there were plans to develop a PlayStation 1 port of the game. Unseen 64 has images of the unfinished game, which appear to be a 3D beat-em-up. Given the boost in hardware capabilities, a PlayStation version of the game would have obviously been graphically superior. X-Men, Mutant Academy, N64. To coincide with the July 14, 2000 release date of the first X-Men film, an X-Men fighting game was released. Mutant Academy was developed by Paradox Development, who you might know from their work on other fighting games, including the Backyard Wrestling series, Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks, and X-Men Next Dimension. This game was made available on PlayStation 1 and Game Boy Color, though the PlayStation version was received much better. The Game Boy Color version had to be altered due to the limitations of the hardware, which caused the game to suffer in quality. Mutant Academy is notable for having the X-Men playable in either their classic comic costumes or their new movie costumes, and characters not in the movie were given designs that matched up with the other modern designs. Early on in the development of Mutant Academy, there were actually 3 versions of the game planned for release. The development leading version was Paradox's PlayStation 1 version, then there was Crawfish Interactive's 2D Game Boy Color version, and an additional N64 version was also planned and entered development at Cyrox Developments. That version was ultimately cancelled after its development shifted from a 2D fighting game into a 3D one. There is some gameplay footage of an early build of this N64 version, which is dated to about a year before the launch of the PlayStation 1 version. It's rough and bare bones, but shows what might have been for fans of the X-Men on the Nintendo console. X-Men Mind Games. In November 1994, Sega released the Sega 32X, an add-on for the Sega Genesis that promised to deliver a high-quality 32-bit gaming experience over the 16-bit base Genesis. One game that was in development for the new hardware was an X-Men title called X-Men Mind Games. It was in development at Scavenger and set to be published by Sega itself, but the fate of the 32X unfortunately ensured this game never saw the light of day. However, it wasn't cancelled before its marketing cycle began. The game was announced, advertised, and even shown at E3 1995. That alone shows that the development of the game was pretty far along before the plug was pulled. On the subject of the game's cancellation, there doesn't seem to be any evidence of a formal cancellation. The game was just never mentioned again or released, and many speculate that it was due to the poor sales figures for its target hardware, the 32X. It's not all bad though. There are rumors that the scrapped work on X-Men Mind Games was used later for the Incredible Hulk: The Pantheon Saga, a top-down action-adventure game that was released for the Sega Saturn in 1997. As far as X-Men Mind Games goes, a prototype of the game was leaked in 2009 by Ryo Suzuki of Sega Saturno. The unfinished build of the third-person action game only features Bishop as a playable character, though it does hint that Wolverine, Iceman, and Rogue would have also been playable characters. Quest Probe's X-Men. For this next cancelled game, we have to go back to the 1980s. In 1983, the developer/publisher Adventure International scored the license to create video games based on Marvel characters. The 10-year agreement between the two companies was the first long-term deal Marvel had ever made for video games. Adventure International then went on to develop Quest Probe, a trilogy of adventure games that were released on platforms like the Apple II, the Commodore 64, and Atari systems. Between 1984 and 1985, there were Quest Probe games featuring the Hulk, Spider-Man, and the final game featured both the Human Torch and Thing from the Fantastic Four. A fourth game began development by Adventure International CEO Scott Adams, but time wasn't on his side. Adventure International went bankrupt in 1986, and work on Quest Probe's X-Men game was never finished. Marvel MMOs. While you might have heard of or even played Marvel Heroes, the Marvel MMO that existed between 2013 and 2017, there have been several attempts at massive online Marvel games that feature the X-Men. The first one was a collaboration between Marvel and Microsoft, called Marvel Universe Online, which was announced in 2006. That game was being developed by Cryptic Studios, who had been sued by Marvel not long before for making City of Heroes. The PC and Xbox 360 game was ultimately cancelled due to the changing MMO landscape, according to Microsoft Game Studios VP at the time, Shane Kim. Then, in November 2021, the studio behind DC Universe Online announced it was working on another Marvel MMORPG. 6 months later, it was cancelled in order to diversify the massive $50.5 million planned for the project on other smaller projects. Not too long after, images of the cancelled project began to surface, including some concept art and an image of the faction selection screen, which includes the X-Men as an option. Thanks to Mike Alexander for writing this episode. Make sure to like the video and subscribe for a ton more cancelled games. Check out our recent episodes on every cancelled Spider-Man game and every cancelled Batman game. Thanks for watching. This has been a GameFAQs special.